Peak Human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak 人間
Peak Human.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Peak Human. I'm Brian Sanders, and I hope everyone had a great Christmas, Hanukkah, and any other holidays, including upcoming New Year's. I hope everyone didn't eat too much ridiculous food. I did a little bit, but I also burned it off playing a lot of beach volleyball here in Hawaii. I've been mainly working on the film. Sometimes I forget to even go outside and get some vitamin D and just spend all day indoors working like I did today. But the Food Lies film is coming. It's going to be amazing. I can't tell you how much work we're putting into it. Anyway, this interview has been a long time coming. I've always loved everything Robb has been doing over the years. He's been doing great work in this space far before I had a clue about health. It was a treat to dive deep with him on a variety of topics, including censorship, the importance of the free share of ideas, germ versus terrain theories, carnivore, protein and lifespan, seafood and human development, seed oils, electrolytes, and a lot more. It's a very different episode than any of his recent interviews, so I definitely wouldn't miss this one. Everyone listening should already know who he is, but it doesn't hurt to read over a quick bio. Robb Wolf, a former research biochemist, is the 2 times New York Times/Wall Street Journal best-selling author of The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat. Robb has transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people around the world via his top-ranked iTunes podcast, books, and seminars. He is the co-creator of The Sacred Cow film and book as well. Robb has functioned as a review editor for the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism, Biomed Central, and as a consultant for the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Program. He serves on the board of directors advisors for Specialty Health Inc., the Chickasaw Nation's Unconquered Life Initiative, and a number of innovative startups with a focus on health and sustainability. And just a few words before we begin about Nose to Tail. This is how this podcast is possible. This is my company. I don't take any outside advertisements. I turn everything down so I can focus on products that I make and I care about. And our main bread and butter is the exact opposite of bread and butter. It's grass-fed, grass-finished, sustainably raised, really healthy beef, buffalo, lamb, pork, and chicken. We have the high omega-3, low omega-6 pork and chicken. We have the primal ground beef with the organs mixed in. That's the beef and buffalo and pork, actually, that has the liver, heart, kidney, and spleen mixed in. You can get this delivered to your door, nosetotale.org. We also have a bunch of other products there, like the beef tallow skin products. This is the icing on the cake. And actually, the skin food is kind of like icing. It's an amazing product. It's the soft, whipped tallow that feeds your skin. It gives your skin the nutrients it needs. And as Mary Ruddick says, you shouldn't put anything on your skin that you wouldn't put in your mouth. We have a few of these left, but we also have the soap and the lip balm. We also have the seasonings, which I use at every single meal. I either mix one with sour cream and use it as a sauce on the side or put it on my meat. It's great to have a different flavor of meat each time I eat. We also have the cool hats with the giant steak or the nose tail hats and the biltong. I've been getting high on my own supply over here in Hawaii, been giving them out as gifts to my family and eating them because it's hard to resist. This stuff is great. It's soft. It has extra fat. It's not like the chewy beef jerky you're used to. It's a South African specialty. I make it. My business partner from South Africa. And any meat eater would enjoy this, especially on the go. So check it out at nosetotale.org. We also have the Sapien podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to that as well. We're putting out new episodes in our new studio. And we have the Sapien program for people who want to drastically change their life and lose weight. And we have your back with Dr. Gare. We have an entire program. You can learn more about it at sapien.org. We also have the tribe. And the Sapien tribe is where you can support the show and get a bunch of perks like bonus episodes of the podcast, private feed. We do the private Zoom calls, all kinds of great stuff. I could go on and on about this stuff. Just go to sapien.org and nosetotale.org and check those 2 things out. That's the way to support the show. That's the way you get quality products that I really believe in and that bring value to you. It's not just that you're supporting the show, you're getting valuable products at a good price. So check those out and let's get on to the show with my man, Robb Wolf. And we're live with Robb Wolf. How's it going, my friend?
All good. Another day above ground. So I think that's good. It's good for me. My wife would probably be better off differently. Like I'm probably worth more dead than alive, but it's working for me.
Wow. You do some good things, man.
I try. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. It's been a while. We've run into each other for years now at these conferences and whatnot. But yeah, I'm glad to see what you're doing. I got your book, Sacred Cow, you and Diana. I see it in the background there.
Yep.
I read Wired to Eat, and I did see the film as well. Sacred Cow was great.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Thank you.
Thank you for putting it out there. We are doing films together, right? We have more people in the community doing films. The more, the better.
Absolutely. The vegans have really kicked our ass on that front. Like the ancestral health community is put out as many offerings as we can. But, when you're facing a group of folks that can crowdfund a movie and get $2, $3, $4 million in a weekend, and we don't do that.
Yeah, or they
we
have
don't
Uncle
crowdfund
James
multi-million dollars in a weekend. So yeah,
they have the resources. They have Mr. Cameron over there with all his pea protein money.
Yep.
But we're doing what we can, and yeah. So I'm getting through your book. I haven't finished it, but it's really interesting. When I started reading it, there was debate that you were going to do with John Mackey and John McDougall.
Yeah.
That you mentioned that didn't happen, and was interesting because I had no idea who this John Mackey character was until Joe Rogan had him on his show recently.
The CEO of Whole Foods. Yeah.
Oh, it was so annoying hearing him talking to Joe, and Joe is pretty good. He's pushing back. He's had a lot of great guests, right? He knows what he's talking about. You were on what, twice?
Twice. Yep.
He's had all kinds of people. He's had Gary Taubes, Nita Teicholz, Mark Sisson, Chris Kresser. He just had Saladino. He's had the whole crew on, but he was trying to push back a bit. I don't know. I didn't listen to the whole thing.
I've had to do a little bit of a Joe Rogan experience holiday. Like, he does amazing work, but it's just gotten to be a bit much of late. And I've been really listening to the Dark Horse podcast with Brett Weinstein and his wife, Heather Hying. And I think it's one of, if not the best podcasts out there right now. It just covers evolutionary biology, and it really touches on a lot of kind of the censorship, the danger that liberal Western civilizations face with this kind of uprising of kind of outrage culture and woke culture and everything. And we are clearly at one another's throats, and it doesn't really seem to be getting better. And but they couch a lot of this stuff from like an evolutionary biology perspective. And they also were some of the first people to really feel the blunt force trauma of this. They were both professors at Evergreen University, a very progressive leaning liberal arts school in Portland, Oregon. And a few years ago, they had this day of exclusion or something. I forget exactly, but historically, like once a year, they would have a day where people of color would not come to school so that people would feel the lack of their presence there, which I think is very noble and interesting. But then it shifted to they wanted days where people not of color could not go to school. And that included the professors. And Brett was like, no, I have obligations to all kinds of people, and this is really unfair. And so he went to school, and then it got around that he was on campus and a white male. And so roving bands of students were looking for him with baseball bats and crowbars. And it really went crazy. And a lot of people kind of said that, this is just on universities. This is a really isolated situation. And he was like, no, it's not. This is the beginning of something that's going to be really, really bad. And so they were really some of the canaries in the coal mine on stuff like that. And I think that that's a big chunk of kind of where we are now. And, circling back to Rogan, I think he's done a really good job of highlighting some of the dangers around this stuff too. So definitely all props to him on stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. I haven't listened to Brett's podcast, but I've heard him on other shows, and I've been really into this stuff. And I'm glad that you brought it up, because I wanted to talk about censorship and so many other things around that going on these days. And the COVID stuff has woken a lot of people up. I mean, it's a sad thing that's happening to our worlds, but there is a small glimmer of goodness where I think it's woken a lot of people up. I certainly woke up. I kind of was just following the mainstream path and just buying into things, which is strange because our animal-based community, ancestral health community, whatever you want to call it, has really been red pilled on the nutrition stuff. We're like, hey, everything we're told is wrong about this stuff. These government bodies don't have our best interests in mind. There's all this stuff going on with the healthcare system and the food system. And then I thought that's where it stops. And then I realized it doesn't just stop there.
Right.
And it's very obvious that our world, our ancestral world, has woken up and is pushing back. And I just want to get into all these type of things. You've felt some of the censorship. You've kind of been trying to not leave, but started
I would leave if I
account.
could, but I still have too much work to do, so I can't totally split yet. But yeah.
So we're taking some of these little precautions, starting a Parler account or doing other things, but maybe what's your idea of why it's important to have this free speech or why it's good to look at both sides? Because I always talk about, let's look at both sides of things in my Food Lies film context. What can we learn from the vegans? Why do high carb diets work sometimes, right? It's like you have to look at both sides to understand it. And no film really does that. It's always, like you said, the vegan film that's just propaganda. So when we look at the bigger picture, let me ask you, why is it important we have voices on both sides?
Man, so I'll do my best to answer that, and it's not going to sound like I am, but I'm hopefully, if I can keep it all together, paint this story arc. So it was about 3 years ago that we started noticing that we have things like the Keto Masterclass that we sell online, and you do Facebook ads with it, and you pay some money, and it gets out to a certain number of people, and hopefully you make more money than you put into it and whatnot. And it was a good gig for us, and a lot of folks bought things like the Keto Masterclass, and based off the feedback, it seems to provide a lot of value. We try to provide way more value than what we charge people for. And we've historically had a well-ranking website, not the biggest one in the world, but certainly like in the top 1 to 5% of all websites on the planet, particularly within the health space. And we just started seeing some really interesting stuff. Like on Facebook, it started getting virtually impossible to run ads around anything ketosis related and have it be profitable. Like they would allow you to just break even, but not make any money above and beyond that. We went to literally the largest Facebook ad agency in the world, and we're like, hey, do you think you could sell this? And they looked at what our past metrics were, and they're like, we've got this. We'll be able to sell the pants off this thing. They couldn't do any better than we did. And they were like, you're being shadow banned. Like there's no other way around it. You're being throttled. This thing is being purposefully kind of controlled to make it so that this content is just barely break even, because at break even, we keep paying Facebook, but we don't make any money. And at some point, like that's actually not a viable business. And then that kind of motored along for a little bit. And then one day I had a message from like Mark Sisson and Chris Kresser. They're like, hey, did you see the Google algorithm update? I'm like, no. And we've faced multiples of these over the course of time. Like we would have good SEO standing, and then Google would change things and it would plummet, and then you work and build things back up. But my site traffic, along with site traffic of a good number of other people, had fallen by like 97, 99% overnight due to this traffic update. And it was a lot of people in the kind of low carb space. There are people in the broader low carb space that are kind of anti-vaccine, that are into like, the 5G will cause you to grow an arm out of your head and stuff like that. So it's a mixed bag. But there was kind of a core commonality that most of these folks that had experienced this website, basically this being removed from the internet, more or less. There was kind of a low carb theme to it. And it was interesting because like the movie What the Health, I did this very extensive review of it. It was basically, okay, at time point 1 minute, 20 seconds, they made this claim. Here's what the research is. This is what they're claiming. This is what I found. And I went through the whole movie like that. And when you searched What the Health, my review came up within the top 2 or 3 total returns, to say nothing of just the front page. After this algorithm update, you couldn't find that review. You had to search specifically Robb Wolf What the Health review, and then you could find it. But if you knew that, then you didn't need to really go looking for it. And some of the analysis that popped up out of this was that about 3 years ago, Google and GlaxoSmithKline had an exchange, and I forget which direction it went, whether Google invested in GlaxoSmithKline or vice versa, but it was almost $1 billion. And the process made the case that Google could arguably now be considered a pharmaceutical company. Okay, so there's all that stuff going on. And then when you look at kind of the benefits of this lower carb ancestral way of eating, virtually everything that we're trying to deal with in modern pharmaceuticals are, an extension of metabolically driven disease. Type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, different accelerated rates of cancer and whatnot. So this whole low carb idea is really kind of, I guess, dangerous or antagonistic towards the business model that these folks have on this topic. That gets a little conspiracy theory, but it's interesting. Like, it's very interesting.
Cool.
Like, why would this group of people be singled out? There's definitely some kind of anti-vax folks out there. I'm not anti-vax. I'm also not completely oblivious to the notion that any medical intervention carries some degree of potential risk to it. So like what we did with our kids is vaccinate them largely along the lines of what I received as a kid, and we spaced them out. And I tried to make sure the sourcing was as good as possible. Sometimes we asked for different options and whatnot. But there's a lot of elements to the ancestral health scene that really pushes back against a lot of this dominant narrative. Now, your question was, why is this censorship dangerous? So about 2.5 or 3 years ago, the group Type 1 Grit, which is this low-carb Facebook-based group that uses the Bernstein Diabetes Solution method for managing specifically Type 1 diabetes, but also Type 2 diabetes. But I would argue Type 1 diabetes is about the hardest metabolic condition to deal with, or maybe not the hardest, but it's very, very challenging. Like getting the air-fuel mixture right on protein, carbs, fat, and managing insulin from outside the body when insulin is supposed to be produced inside the body. And insulin should normally be released out of the beta cells of the pancreas. And the first thing they encounter are the alpha cells of the pancreas, which shut down the production of glucagon, which is one of the big problems that you face in type 1 diabetes, is either uncontrolled ketoacidosis or sky-high glucose levels, or both of them. And that's because of glucagon not getting managed well. And the standard of care for type 1 diabetes is appalling. I forget the exact number, something like 60 or 70% of people who develop type 1 diabetes go on to develop type 2 diabetes because of the terrible mismanagement of the condition. Pretty much eat all the carbs you want, try to control it with fast-acting insulin. And the analogy that Dr. Bernstein, who is 83 years old, still maintains a full medical practice, has been a type 1 diabetic since his 30s, which usually people die much earlier than that, but he's done an amazing job of managing his type 1 diabetes. He likens the current management practices of type 1 diabetes to being on an icy road and overcorrecting. Like, you just can't make things work. So, and he's kind of interesting. He advocates a high protein, low carb, not necessarily high fat method of managing type 1 diabetes. And it works amazing. It works so well that it got the attention of some researchers at Harvard, and a study was put together, and some type 1 diabetic kids were tracked relative to a cohort of kids that were following standard of care. And that type 1 grit group, the researchers said that they had never seen glycemic control like this in type 1 diabetic kids. Their A1Cs were better than average population normal kids. It was fucking amazing, just amazing. And the big danger in all this is now with the censorship that's occurring, because animal proteins are associated with negative consequences with climate change, because low carb is seen as this fringe element that's not accepted by mainstream media. These things are implicitly verboten from Facebook, Google, YouTube. At any given moment, your channel or your broadcast medium could be shut down. And the only reason why this research happened was because of the free exchange of ideas on a very cool platform like Facebook that got enormous amounts of attention, enough attention to warrant top-level researchers to look at this and investigate it and dig up funding to do this. And what we're doing in this scenario, when people say the science is settled or we need to just listen to what the accepted topic is, it's over. We have ceased to make progress. And even in this COVID process, there was a period of time when the CDC and the World Health Organization said that masks don't work. And this was very early on. And they did this because they treated us like children. They didn't want everybody to go out and buy all the N95 masks. And instead of saying, hey, listen, this is a really important thing. These things need to be saved for healthcare providers and frontline workers. don't go buy all these. We're going to figure out methods around this. But instead of doing that, they treated us like children, lied to us about mask usage. And I'm actually in the kind of, I don't think masks do remotely as much as what a lot of people think. They are not. Condoms work way better for preventing pregnancies than masks do for preventing the transmission of airborne illnesses. Just put it that way.
Really quick. Yeah, really quick. There was just an article today that came out looking at the mask compliance, and the U.S. has the most mask compliance. We're upwards 90% compliance, 94% in some of these cities, and it's still spreading like crazy. So that's just an interesting little thing, but keep going.
Yeah, and if you create a situation, so what's interesting is large swaths of the ancestral health scene are in the crosshairs of kind of big tech because it doesn't fit with the dominant narrative. And things like the discovery around the efficacy of this type 1 grit protocol would have never happened. And all these other interesting things, like we've had research on the autoimmune paleo diet that could potentially have never happened and may not happen in the future because the free exchange of ideas and people being able to N=1 experiment with this stuff, it becomes difficult or impossible for it to happen. And then we even have scenarios in which the government itself, because science changes, if you draw a line in the sand and say, this is the only accepted material, then by extension, if the government or researchers discover something new, they are now in non-compliance with the rules that people like Facebook and Google have enacted. And so instead of this being a messy but free process, and I'm kind of amazed by the number of people in the ancestral health scene that are actually excited by the notion of some pimple-faced tech geek at Google or Facebook curating this material. They're like, well, there's just a lot of fake information out there and somebody needs to do something about it. I'm like, well, who? Like, who does this? And what is really frustrating for me is folks don't realize that will continue to contract until the main reason why people are okay with this is that it has not negatively impacted their lives yet. And by the time it does, and by the time that people start pushing back against it, it's going to be too goddamn late. I'm really in that camp that we are better off with free exchange of ideas, and it's messy. There's lots of disinformation, but I prefer the world where we hash out those inconsistencies in a free, open fashion versus having these intermediaries try to decide what we should and shouldn't see, what we should or shouldn't be allowed to talk about. And some people agree with that and some people don't. And it's pretty powerful lines that divide all that.
There's so much there. Yeah, people who are for this censorship, it hasn't come to them yet. It hasn't happened. That's a good point, because this comes up in our community where people like, we should tax sugar. Like, we all know that sugar is bad. We should tax sugary beverages. And I'm like, I don't know, because what happens when they try to tax meat? What happens when they come after us? It's a slippery slope, right? We don't want to put these regulations. The better way is to have free exchange of information, ideas, and let people know that sugar is harmful and eating added sugar, and especially in the form of a beverage, is terrible.
Right.
Instead, the scientific part, where we always discover new science. Like, you use the example of Fauci came on and said, masks don't work. You know, they're so stupid. You don't need them. And then, of course, he switched and said, this is the only thing we need to do. Just stay home and be scared and wear the mask. But this is how science works. It evolves, and it evolves through open conversation. And I love to bring up the nature, I think it's the Nature of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn, where false, trivial, obvious. I'll just say it one more time for people. This is how things work in science. First, it's false. They're like, no, wrong, you're wrong. Then, it comes around years later. Oh, it's trivial. It's like, oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah, this is not that important. And then it becomes obvious. It's like, oh, we knew it all along.
Right.
And this is how it's always been. Like, we think we know everything. I'm curious to know what's going to change in our ancestral community in 100 years. But the idea is based on ancestral principles. So maybe we'll find more out about our ancestors, and then we can change our views. We should always be open.
Yeah. And, folks here's two, I think, good examples of where the mainstream, and that one is going from over 100 years ago and one is pretty recent. In Victorian era Europe, infant mortality rates were stunningly high. Like, having a baby in a hospital was like, the likelihood of both the mom and the baby dying were stunningly high. And this Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis started kind of looking at this thing, what he noticed, and he is one of the first people that arguably started using some statistical analysis to try to figure out epidemiology effectively. And what he noticed was that poor women who gave birth on the street were having better health, and their babies were dying at a lower frequency than the wealthier mothers that were giving birth in hospitals. This was before the germ theory of infection. So there wasn't really any thought about like bacteria or viruses or anything like that. And he started poking around on what the doctors did, both in delivering babies and what they did in their off time. And this, again, was very early in medicine, and like anatomy and physiology were in their infancy. And what doctors did was spent a lot of time in the morgue dissecting cadavers to better understand anatomy. The anatomy classes at that time were super rudimentary compared to what we know now. So doctors would routinely go from working on cadavers to delivering babies and then back again. And he made the crazy assumption that maybe there was something on these dead, decaying bodies that may be problematic for babies and mothers. And so he suggested that these physicians wash their hands in a 10% bleach solution. And when they started doing that, the infant mortality rate just plummeted. And he started trying to talk about this, and people said he was crazy. And again, these people were no smarter or dumber than we are. They happened to live in a time before us, but the scientific method was getting established. But also the tendency for humans to just dismiss anything new out of hand, like Max Planck made an observation that science progresses one funeral at a time, or like that's attributed to him. But Ignaz Semmelweis ended up being institutionalized and died from like insanity. And then 30 or 40 years later, Koch's postulate was formalized and the germ theory of infection was adopted into medicine. And people look back and they're like, oh man, that Ignaz Semmelweis was actually on point. And so that one's kind of a long ago example, but a really profound one. More recently, some researchers, one specific guy, and I'm blanking on his name, but up until very comparatively recently, it was assumed that peptic ulcers were a consequence of stress. And so you needed to reduce your stress, don't eat spicy foods and all this. But this guy started poking around and looking at things. And what he noticed was that people with peptic ulcers were pretty uniformly infected with this bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. And he postulated that H. pylori was actually the causative factor in peptic ulcers. He was attacked as if he was suggesting that you should eat babies on Sunday mornings or something. Like it was crazy. It wasn't, oh, well, that's interesting, let's test it. It's like, this is preposterous. We know what causes peptic ulcers. It's stress. The science is settled. And this guy lost funding. He had all these problems. But what he ultimately ended up doing was basically carrying out an example of kind of Koch's postulate, which he demonstrated that he did not have either peptic ulcers or H. pylori infection, like they did gastric imaging and scoped him and all that stuff. Then he infected himself with H. pylori and developed a peptic ulcer. He cultured the H. pylori out of his peptic ulcer wounds. It matched genetically the one that he had been infected with. And then he went through a round of antibiotics, got rid of the H. pylori and showed that it was no longer there. And lo and behold, his peptic ulcer healed. We just have shit like this all the time. And not every idea that comes down the pipe is accurate, but this is why free exchange of ideas is absolutely critical. Johns Hopkins just posted a paper that was suggesting that total death burden for the United States is not greater under the current COVID pandemic than what it was from previous years. I'm not entirely sure what to draw from that. There's a bunch of different things. Like it's almost never like your knee-jerk reaction, but it's really interesting. But Johns Hopkins was pressured into retracting the paper because they said that it posed too great of a risk for COVID skeptics and deniers to use that as justification for doing XYZ. So instead of...
It was actually a presentation. It was actually a presentation, not a official paper, but yes, it was retracted and it was by one of their students. So keep going.
And so there's probably some really important stuff to be dug into there. Like Are we going to have an increase in death 2 years from now because people aren't being screened for cancer, because kids aren't getting childhood vaccinations? Like there's all this shit that needs to be unpacked with that. But will there be a lunatic fringe element that takes this information and runs with it in an inappropriate direction? Yes. Mm-hmm. Is that concerning? Yes. Is the best way to combat that to remove this information from the internet? Or is it to get in and really, in a precise way, understand exactly what is going on there and what the implications are? Because there's almost certainly no first order implications, like the things that a 5-year-old kid could put together. It's going to be second order and third order implications about what is going on here. And that's going to take this important scientific dialogue and statistical analysis to figure out really why is that happening? And then what does it mean? Like, what can we learn from it? And now we have no chance to really dig in and learn from it, or maybe other people will be able to run with that. But what's interesting is the only place that information now freely circulates is within the lunatic fringe, which are not scientists. They are not people looking at what does this stuff mean? They've already drawn their conclusions from it. So I get that there's hazard there. But again, I guess I just really strongly side with that freedom piece, and then these difficult challenges of unpacking that. Well, that's what we need to do. We need to have discussions and, apply the scientific method and be open to where this information could take us.
That's really important. So you're saying I agree, there's always the lunatic fringe, and they always co-opt these things, and then they take it down these rabbit holes, and then it makes us look bad who are trying to examine the real truth to it. Right. And then that's why these conspiracy theorists, it's like, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Like, no, I'm just looking at the other side of things. I know there are conspiracy theorists. It's like, yes, Alex Jones, maybe he's talking about lizard people, but maybe there's some other stuff he has that's correct. And another good thing to think about is the antidote. The cure for misinformation is more information. Or, you know what I mean? You can't just censor it. You have to just let people see better information, right? So then if you have better information and it's allowed, the free speech is allowed, then that would suppress the wacky lizard people stuff, right? That's the solution, right?
Yeah, and you won't ever 100% fix that, but even in horrible totalitarian regimes where political dissenters are shot and their body parts are sold on the black market for organ donation, that doesn't fix dissension there 100% either. And people are facing the death penalty for just not agreeing with the state. So I don't have to go too far that even where I'm a conspiracy theorist, just because I'm not 100% sold that masks are the panacea that people offer. And you and I have been, people like Metabolic Mike and stuff like that have been beating this drum. It's like, we're coming up on a year into this thing and people are worse metabolic health, not better. And that outside of age, which we can't change, our metabolic health is the greatest influencer of whether or not COVID is a bad cold or a death sentence for people, or if you end up with some of this long haul problems. And any messaging around adequate vitamin D levels, or pick vegan, pick low carb, pick whatever the fuck you want, but do something so you lose some weight and get more metabolically healthier. This would transform the rates of illness, the hospitalizations, the death rate. And it is completely absent from the World Health Organization down to local public health authorities. It is gone. And so even suggesting that we should get more metabolically healthy, we are by extension the lunatic fringe, the conspiracy theorists. And that may actually be the one lever that we have really legit control over to be able to affect how bad this situation is for us.
It's so important. I like that Bill Maher is the one guy talking about it in the mainstream. Even though he has these sort of vegetarian ideas, at least he's talking about it. He's the only one like, where were you? You told people to just be afraid, stay in their homes and watch Netflix, and you're a hero. He said that. It was so funny. Watch Netflix, stay home, and you're a hero. We need to be talking about fixing your diet and lifestyle. There's so many things we can do. I like to bring up my friend Laura Spath. You probably have seen her online. She lost half her body weight in 11 months.
Wow.
So
wow.
She went from something like 300 to 150. She used a carnivore diet. She did that in 11 months. What happened in the first 6 months? Probably 75 pounds. So someone can lose 75 pounds in 6 months. We were 6 months into the pandemic. No one talked about it. It's insane. All I see, I'm in this apartment complex in LA. All I see is overweight people waddling up to get Uber Eats. That's all I see. It's like the Uber Eats comes, the DoorDash comes, they waddle up, and then they go back into their house. Haven't talked to anyone in my apartment complex. They're all wearing masks and they won't talk to me. And it's crazy. But that's beyond the point. I wanted to kind of circle back on 3 things I wrote down that you talked about. The germ versus terrain. So I really appreciate the germ theory. And then I also appreciate people talking about the terrain theory, which is kind of opposite, is that it's about your host. And I think it's somewhere in the middle, though. Obviously, there is a germ theory, right? Like there are germs out there, like you said. And some people take it too far and be like, there's no germs. It's all like your body and your body can resist anything. I'm like, no, that's not true either. So what do you think about this? Because I always talk about this too with corona or any flu. I haven't been sick in, 5-6 years. I keep losing count how long it's been because I'm healthy. Once I changed my diet, I didn't get sick anymore. Before I had my old diet, I was sick every 3 months. So there is something to this.
There absolutely is. And the fact that your health status influences the vector of an infectious agent, it's kind of like water for fish. It's like, this is so obvious that I'm kind of shocked that like there is this terrain theory out there. But like the thing that I push back, so for me, that is like the breatharian of this whole thing. Yeah, breatharians out there, they're like, man, if you're just spiritual enough, you can just convert sunlight into energy and you don't need to eat. And I'm like, man, I guess all those kids in sub-Saharan Africa are just fucking assholes and deserve to die, because they just couldn't reach this plane of enlightenment where we know that there are some things like smallpox, like dengue fever, like Ebola, and even within that, there is natural genetic and epigenetic variation that confers greater or lesser degrees of susceptibility. Sickle cell anemia is a great example of this. It is one of the fastest developing genetic traits in all of human history. It developed within the swidging cultures of Africa, where people started doing slash and burn type agriculture, which created open areas for growing food, but it also created opportunity for standing water for mosquitoes. And where these people historically had moved around a lot and didn't really live in fixed structures, they started making these thatched roof houses, which are perfect environment for mosquitoes to live in. And the load of malaria that these people were exposed to was absolutely crushing. And then a modification in the red blood cells within these people caused them to change their morphology in such a way that it limits the ability for malaria to enter the cells and to take up residence there. People with heterozygous sickle cell anemia have protection against the infection, but also tend not to die young from it. People with homozygous sickle cell anemia have protection against the malaria infection, but they tend to die in their early teens. Like, it is remarkably injurious. And it's a 1/4 death rate for populations that have the sickle cell anemia gene. But it is still a net win for the people living in these really malaria impacted environments. And for African Americans who have been in the United States for some extended period of time, they are losing the sickle cell gene because no longer confers an advantage, and it still has enough of a selection pressure causing early death that it's starting to drop out of the population. I don't know where there is no terrain modification that's going to make you impervious to malaria. It's just ridiculous. So now, again, somebody who's otherwise healthy, somebody who otherwise has good vitamin D status and all these things, are they likely to navigate any given dangerous scenario better than someone else? Yes. But we even have an example of that that's to the contrary, which was flu pandemic of 1918. It largely ignored the young. It largely ignored the old. The average average age of maximum mortality was 28 years old. And this was one of the things that was so horrific about it. It just crushed this otherwise young, healthy population. And they think that there was a cytokine storm element to it. And again, maybe vitamin D levels could mitigate that. But that is a scenario, again, where arguably the healthiest, youngest people who would be normally most resistant to influenza, that particular strain figured out a way of capitalizing on the most healthy people. So the terrain stuff it goes to Wackyville for me really quickly. It again, is generally being healthy good, but like when people say that like all of these viruses emerge out of our genome and that they're not really an infectious agent and whatnot, I don't have a lot of buy-in on that. Yeah,
I know.
Yeah.
I actually don't even know that much about it. I still don't know what the terrain people think. I just know it's somewhere in that realm of if you're healthy, you can fight off things. That's very clear. I think. Tell me if you think this is true. I think the immune system is the simplest, most complex thing in the world. It's so complex, we'll never understand it completely, but it's, in a sense, very simple. It's like if you have too many stressors, too many insults to it, it goes down. I know I remember when I got sick, because I went out all weekend, I didn't sleep, I was stressed out, maybe I was studying for a test, I got sick. It's just too many insults. And I can feel myself in the past few years almost getting sick because I'll be traveling, all this stuff, stay up late. Then I'll try to work out, do like a big workout on a Monday. And I'm like, that's too much.
Yep.
So in that way, it's a pretty simple, but of course it's the most complex thing ever.
Yeah. Yeah. It processes more information than our brain does when you get right down to it. When you look at identifying proteins, identifying substances, creating antibodies to it, the memory T cells, the B cells and everything, like there's arguably more information processing occurring in our immune system than happens between our ears, which is amazing. Yeah.
But in a sense, you can affect it. Just live a healthy diet and lifestyle.
Absolutely. And that will improve almost any scenario. But it's so disrespectful in a way to like indigenous populations that were exposed to like smallpox and infectious agents that they had no innate immunity to. And it just destroyed their cultures and their populations. It's reminiscent to me of people who are like, if you're just a breatharian, you just need to get spiritual enough and then you can transform sunlight directly into energy. And it's like, if we develop a strain of people that have chlorophyll in their skin, I'll maybe start buying into some of that, but I'm pale and or red. I'm not green. So like, that's not going to happen, Yeah.
That's what, yeah. You can't say, oh, these people just didn't have a good enough immune system, right? It's like, oh, no, if they're living their native diet and lifestyle, they probably had an amazing immune system. They're probably very healthy, but this novel thing came their way and ruined them. But the other two things really quick. Oh yeah. I wrote that the type 1 diabetes way back then. I just want to point that out. We had a great interview with Dr. Gary. I do this other podcast with Sapien, and he uses a carnivore diet. So we're very supportive of carnivore, but it's not our thing.
Right.
And
same here.
Yeah. It's just saying that how amazing it is. This guy is a young guy, 30, and just doing so well with type 1, just amazing. And it's just, he does it with carnivore, and it's like the variables, there's so few that, if he's just eating the meat, like you said with Bernstein, it's a lot of protein, a little bit of fat, no carbs, just so easy to maintain that.
Yeah. It's interesting because it flies in the face of a lot of the gluconeogenic phobic people out in keto land. And I'm not saying that there's not an application for that more fat-centric approach, but the interesting thing is what Bernstein found is a more traditional ketogenic diet, because of the reliance on fat, you end up in this state of physiological insulin resistance, which for you and me is not a big deal. It doesn't really matter. But for the type 1 diabetic, they do still need to take some amount of insulin to manage what they have going on. And if they are inducing physiological insulin resistance from that high fat intake, it creates bigger swings in their dosing relative to blood glucose levels. Whereas if they rely on a more protein-centric approach, they provide adequate protein to the liver releases glucose at an incredibly predictable rate, and the fat intake is low enough that we're not inducing physiological insulin resistance. Now, this chaps the ass of the folks that are like, you should avoid protein and it should be all fat, and they're afraid of mTOR and all this other stuff. But the reality is that for this very difficult to manage condition, it makes it so damn easy so long as you can just get people to that spot and they try it relative to what they've done in the past. It's amazing. And this is, again, where, the dogma can shut down the investigation that would otherwise lead to this opportunity to discover this amazing tool. Like, it doesn't look that far afield from like a traditional ketogenic diet, but metabolically, it's a huge difference.
I love that. And I love that you brought up protein, because so many people, even in our own ancestral health world, are arguing about protein. And yeah, I've talked to a few people that they've been around for 30 years in this world, and they're just like, protein is not good. So what is your take on it? Because yes, you mentioned mTOR, there's different growth factors. Are you afraid of too much protein?
No. Not at all. I did a pretty big talk, and I need to make it generally available. Like, it was going to be like the talk that I gave everywhere. I think the only public place I gave it was Metabolic Health Summit back in January 2020, and then everything got shut down after that. So not many people saw it. But the title of the talk was Longevity, Are We Trying Too Hard? And I really got in and looked at the longevity research, painting protein restriction, fasting, calorie restriction in this kind of beneficial light. And when you dig into that, there's not a lot of research that's been done. But when you look at animals that are fed a species appropriate diet, you don't actually see a benefit with calorie restriction. You actually see a shortening of their lifespans. And so the case that I make is that mainly what calorie restriction and fasting is doing, particularly within animal models, is protecting animals from a terrible lab chow-based diet. Like, are you better off eating more or less of a terrible diet? Clearly less. And when we then start thinking about, can we goose human longevity to be 120 or 150 years, and some things like genetic reaction norms, the way that organisms allocate resources early in life around offspring and whatnot, although I have 2 kids and it feels like an enormous amount of energy allocation, we in the spectrum are not an organism that is well suited for calorie restriction to cause a longevity bump. Some animals are more amenable to that. And it's basically this idea that biology has set them up such that if they can't reproduce now due to scarcity, it will slow the rate of aging so that when scarcity is removed, then they, in theory, would be able to reproduce. And so it kind of buys them some time on that. But when you look at all of this stuff, and again, in this talk, like I have like 88 slides and I go through it in like an hour. Like I'm talking like 600 words a minute to get all this stuff out in a rapid clip. But the case that I make is, once you arrive at something that looks like an ancestral diet and adequate protein and a glycemic load that is appropriate for you, and you're simply not overeating, and I say simply kind of in jest, like in our modern hyper-palatable, highly processed food world, it's very difficult to not overeat. But once you get to a spot where you're consuming adequate protein, getting some sunlight on your skin, exercising, I don't think that there's any real benefit to protein restriction, extended fasting. Maybe do a little bit here and there. Like at the end of the talk, I said maybe like 3 days, once a month, once every other month or something like that. But what I'm noticing is that people in particularly kind of the keto world are doing these extended fasts. They're getting like 40 or 50 grams of total protein a day. They look like raw vegans to me. Like they have no muscle mass on them. They look terrible. They don't seem to have any really great physical capacity. And these folks are terrified of like cancer and cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative disease. All of these things are potentials for all of us. All of us have some risk potential for cancer, for cardiovascular disease, for neurodegenerative disease. I think that living the way that we generally live drops that risk profile to as low as you could possibly get it. But there is a reality. Every single one of us have a guarantee of suffering sarcopenia, muscle loss, as we age. And that is guaranteed. And so if we are not, in my opinion, doing everything we can to fight the sarcopenia process, the muscle wasting process, we are accelerating the aging process. And ironically, as you lose muscle mass, your likelihood of neurological decline increases. Your likelihood of cardiovascular disease increases. Your likelihood of cancer increases. So simply focusing, and it doesn't mean that you need to become a bodybuilder or something like that, but lifting weights 2 to 4 days a week, getting 2, maybe 3 meals a day with a good whack of protein at each meal, maybe doing that in a compressed feeding window. And yeah, maybe once a month or something, doing a 48 or 72-hour fast. That's fantastic. But people go on and on about like autophagy and mTOR and everything. Lifting weights elevates autophagy. But and on the longevity side of things, just getting adequate sunlight is impactful on your health as having or not having a pack a day smoking habit. Like, this is non-controversial stuff. And that's all things that we can generally affect that change. And the outcomes are known. And we know that people who maintain a solid physicality into advanced age, they just do better. So yeah, I'm definitely in that very protein-centric camp. And only time will tell whether or not I'm right on that. But I think that people have gone crazy on this notion that like they're going to fast and protein restrict themselves to some sort of a quality longer life. And I'm just not I think that if we do all these things properly, we could probably live into our 90s in a pretty vibrant capacity. And then the wheels are going to fall off the wagon until we get some very dramatically different interventions. You're not going to see people living to 120 or 150 or beyond that. But someone who is physically active at 90 can have the physical capacity of a sedentary person at 50. So what I take from that is that you could have the quality of life twice as long as what people generally expect. So you're not going to live twice as long, but the life that you live may be twice as good as duration-wise is what we maybe have historically thought.
That's all we can ask for. I think that's what our community wants. It's the live long, drop dead. I guess that's Mark Sisson's thing. Yep. But that's what we want. And I think part of it is waters are muddied because we're studying is living a good diet and lifestyle in general. So if we think, oh, well, the mTOR, this, we're getting into the weeds, but we're overlooking the fact that these people aren't healthy in general and maybe it affects them in different ways. Or like you're kind of saying is our community is doing so many other good things well that this like spike, we eat so much protein, that's not going to affect us like the same way as it affects other people who are metabolically damaged or tons of sugar and they're just a mess.
Yeah, a type 1 diabetic has chronically elevated mTOR, insulin, inflammatory markers because they're awash in too many nutrients. Their insulin is chronically elevated, and that is absolutely a problem. Absolutely a problem. But that is a very different story than someone who is metabolically healthy, who eats 2 meals and a snack, or God forbid, 3 meals a day. That is just not the same story at all. We're talking about pulsatile exposures to these growth factors, which seems to be the way that nature works. It seems to be the way that biology works, this kind of fractal pattern of growth stimulus followed by a recovery or a breakdown stimulus. And striking a balance of that is really important. But exercise is a similar stimulus as fasting. Drinking some coffee is a similar autophagic stimulus as fasting. And there's still no way on an easy level to gauge total autophagy within an organism. And so people are talking about shit that we can't even remotely measure, and they've turned it into a religion. And again, I just see people who don't look as young as what you would otherwise think, given all the stuff that they're doing. They don't carry the muscle mass that I would like them to carry. I don't see them being able to handle themselves in a physical altercation, or if they rolled down a hillside, they could climb back up and get out. Again, I see elements of our community that are as frail as lifelong raw vegans. And that just doesn't strike me as a good thing,
I think there's this balance. I try to come up with this idea of a longevity diet, or what I do, right? I take in all these people's opinions. I've interviewed 150 people. I feel like my whole thing is I just want to listen. I don't have a super strong thing. I didn't come in here as a carnivore guy or I'm the keto guy. I'm just here trying to make a film and learn. And there's a balance. So you mentioned 2 meals a day. I love 2 meals a day. And maybe you don't want to be eating protein, like the old bodybuilder thing. Oh, we got to get 5 boluses, 7 boluses of protein every few hours, and this is going to stimulate the most muscle growth. You don't see these guys living forever. That's not good. That's too much. We're not saying that. We're saying because we eat in a certain way and we're full and we're satiated and we can eat 2 meals a day, and you're just talking about exercise. That's a growth stimulus. I'm talking about longevity mode versus growth mode.
Right.
You want both and find the balance. Tell me, I pitched this to Bickman. I pitched this to a couple other people. I'll pitch it to you now. You don't have to agree with me. But diet that I do these days is I want to be in longevity mode for most of the day. So I'm going to make up numbers, say 21 hours a day. I'll be in longevity mode. I'm waking up. I'm fasting. For lunch, I'm eating a keto meal. I'm not eating a bunch of carbs. I'm not eating too much protein. It's sort of like this keto meal, bacon and eggs type of thing. Then I'll go throughout my day and I'm going to work out at, say, 6 p.m. So I'm in growth mode now. I'm going to work out. I'm doing my workout, short, intense. I'm doing short, brief, intense movements. I'm sprinting. And then I'm going to eat a bigger meal. I'm going to have more protein. I'll have some carbs in there. Get crazy, have some honey to get a pulse out. Big honey, big honey,
crazy,
big honey's got to me. Who knows? I saute up some onions, whatever. I'm in growth mode, and say that's a 3-hour period from when I'm working out, eating, and spiking my growth hormones, all that stuff, and that's a good thing. And then I'm back into longevity mode. I feel like that's kind of the best of both worlds. What do you think?
The only thing I would tweak on that is doing most of that earlier in the day. The only other, and this is kind of a guess now, but it looks like
circadian rhythm type of thing.
Yeah. It looks like we tend to handle carbs a little better earlier in the day. We tend to get some more benefit metabolically from earlier exercise in the day. But again, is that like a 10% difference? Like, is working out at 9 a.m. versus 6 p.m., is there going to be a 10% difference with that? I doubt it. Maybe it's 1%. Maybe it's not even that much because everything else has been so stacked favorably for you. Yeah, like that would be the only thing that I would tweak on that. How old are you?
37.
You're 37, so you're a whippersnapper. I'm going to be 49 here in just a little over a month. A teenage boy or girl who's on a highly athletic program, they should probably eat 3, 4, 5 meals a day potentially. They're growing. Go crazy with that. You get into your 20s, start slowing down just because of work and all the rest of that, then shifting into a mode more like what you're describing, where we punctuate our eating. We're not grazing all the time. Make sure to get adequate protein, get a growth stimulus so that we maintain muscle and bone mass. And that also is helping to maintain our neurological function. It's down regulating the inflammasome, so it improves like cardiovascular endpoints. I think you're hard pressed to get much more than that. Like there's a few interesting pharmaceuticals out there, like the sodium glucose transport inhibitors that cause people to dump blood glucose into the urine, and they have some interesting improvements on ketosis and seem to have some other health and longevity benefits. Throwing in some pharmaceuticals along the way might be like the cherry on the sundae with something like that. But I think it's really hard to improve on something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do think this is just my schedule. I say people do that in the morning. If you can switch to order things, it's still the same thing. You can still do your growth mode in the morning. You can have your meal after that and do the opposite. And absolutely. And you brought up another great point about being in a growth mode. Kids, pregnant people, people who need to gain muscle. Yep. These are 3 different people that don't need to follow the same diet as the people who need to lose weight. Most people in the world need to lose weight. So I just think that too many people ask me, I guess way more people ask you questions about diet, what to do, all this stuff. And I'm like, I can't give you advice. Well, for one, I don't have time to give everyone advice, but are you in the growth mode? Are you in maintenance? Or are you in weight loss? I feel like those are 3 completely separate things. And what is your take on those 3 recommendations, like high level? Like you already said, yes, you can eat more. You can eat 4 times a day if you're a growing teenager. Yes.
I think you hit on it. And the way that I handle that is just asking, what is your goal? And then based off your goal and then where the person is, they're starting here, the goal is here, we can engineer something to get there. And, 1 meal a day in a 6'3" kid who's doing swim practice for 3 hours a day, that's a disaster. Like that is an absolute disaster, and, but we had this when we were running our gym. We had all these cyclists that would look at like what Lance Armstrong was doing, and they would try to eat like that and everything. And like they had like the distended like ectopic fat, whereas like, dude, you have like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. But they'd spend 100 miles a day on their bike, but the quality and the quantity of like the carbohydrate load that they were consuming was completely inappropriate for what they were up to. And it was pulling teeth to get them to modify that. They're like, well, Lance Armstrong's doing this. And it's like, that's great, man. Like, be 15 years younger, be on a bunch of drugs, and then train like you can't even imagine training, and then we'll maybe talk turkey around that.
That's funny. Yeah. Or the Michael Phelps, like, oh, this guy eats Subways and like 10 pizzas a day. I'm like, all right, we need to not worry about Michael Phelps.
Yeah.
All right. So some other things here. What about seed oils? This is such an interesting topic to me. People are doing great work. Interviewed Kate Shanahan, Tucker Goodrich, Saladino's on a roll these days with the seed oil stuff. But then I find there's a little bit of like, wait a second here, because there's like the Loma Linda people. There's people, these vegetarians that are doing okay. The people who are actually healthy, who are eating these seed oils, are eating a lot of plant foods and doing okay and living kind of long. Like, do you think that kind of disproves this notion that these are the devil, or is it just when in excess? So this is my thought, is that some of these people who manage to be really healthy and do all the good lifestyle factors well, like the Loma Linda people, for example, but they're not overeating. They're somehow maintaining this good body composition and eating higher PUFAs than we'd like, probably, and they're living along. So maybe is it just because most people can't do that? Most people are getting the high omega-6 ratio, and they're also overweight or eating too much or eating the other inflammatory foods. But just, yeah, what's your take in general on like how big a factor is it? Because I know I always just break it down into the three things. It's the sugar, it's the refined grains, and the seed oils. These are kind of well known as our enemies since Weston Price and John Yudkin and all these other people have kind of pointed these out. And I think that's very consistent, that these are our three things, and the combination of them are ruining our society. Maybe you could say your pecking order of those, or how do you think they play a role into each other?
I piss everybody off about this. I'll try to remember to answer this thing appropriately, but there is some interesting stuff. So like there was the Ansel Keys study that was basically lost to history, where they implemented a low saturated fat diet. And this is something that you could never do today. And it's part of the reason why this thing is so valuable. It was in thousands of hospitalized mental patients. And so these people were living effectively in a metabolic ward. We knew exactly what they ate and when they ate it. And one group ate kind of a standard American diet with saturated fat here. And this other group had saturated fat removed, and they added additional short chain omega-3 and omega-6, basically these things like corn oil and soybean oil and stuff like that. And these folks that had lower cholesterol levels and died at higher rates of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. So we have one of these things, like it's kind of a gold standard randomized controlled trial in a way. Like we're never going to be able to do something like that again. And so it's really interesting. But when you start getting in and looking at actually the traditional diets of existing hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists, people like the Kung San that got an enormous amount of their nutrition from the monongo nut, they have remarkably high intakes of short chain omega-3 and omega-6s, but they're definitely not overeating all the time. Different tribes within the American West, like relying on pecans as an example. We just have historical examples of people obtaining significant amounts of polyunsaturated fats from whole food sources, and they do just fine. And when we're talking about modifying folks, their diet in a way that looks kind of more ancestral, they're not eating the breads, they're not eating the sugar, they're not eating these combinations of sugar and seed oil and whatnot, which at the end of the day, I think the biggest problem here is when people overeat, then the impacts of these pro-inflammatory foods are really remarkable. And I think another piece of this, which I have been meaning to get in and dig it up, it's funny how this stuff goes through evolution. So like over 10 years ago, folks were really in a tither about seed oils, about linoleic acid and whatnot. Matt Lalonde did a pretty good deep dive on it, and he made the case that so long as you have adequate EPA and DHA, it didn't really matter what else you did. And this was mainly an issue exposed. So two things there. Overeating creates more of a problem, but overeating creates a problem no matter what. Like that's just a known entity, but it maybe exacerbates the problems of these seed oils. But if you are deficient in EPA and DHA, then it allows that omega-6, that arachidonic acid pathway to take a disproportionate impact on the inflammasome and health consequences. So that's one thing. Like, I don't think it's as big a deal as like, I don't know that I would make a case not to eat chicken based off of sustainability thoughts, not the fact that it's eating grains and it may have higher PUFAs. Like, I personally don't really buy that. Another thing that absolutely chaps my ass is, so like Melissa Urban, Whole30, she just released this salad oil line, and it's from high oleic safflower. People lost their fucking minds over it. Like, they just went crazy. Oh, you're so unethical. And I don't really care. I have no dog in the fight. I don't own a salad oil dressing company one way or the other. But when you look at the saf oil within high oleic saf oil, its omega-3 or the short chain PUFA content there is about 4%. Within avocado, it's about 8 or 9%. Within olive oil, it can be as low as 3% or as high as 22%. And this is the thing that super chaps my ass. You have people, and I really called a bunch of people out on this because they're like, it's so unethical to do this. And I'm like, do you know the different relative ratios between high oleic safflower, regular safflower, avocado oil, and olive oil? Not a single person did. I'm like, you guys need to shut your fucking mouths until you're at least, like, if you have an opinion on this, but you don't even know what the composition is of this stuff, you're kind of being an idiot. And I tried not to be too big of a dick about it, but I really called some people out rather harshly on it and posted these resources. And they're like, oh shit, I didn't know that. So this is a little bit of my problem with, it's very easy to start creating a lot of bandwidth, and you get a bunch of momentum, and it's hard these days to stand out from the crowd because there's so much noise and so many people competing for attention. And an easy way to get a notoriety is to just draw this really hard line in the sand and say, seed oils are the devil and they're the root cause of all problems. And they are clearly a problem under some circumstances, but that just kind of like monochromatic treatment of it, I don't know that it really does anybody any favors. And then people, it's like, even if you're eating a salad, like, are you putting half a bottle of this salad dressing on it? I don't know, man. It just starts.
Like a tablespoon.
It starts making me kind of crazy. It just feels like, one, people are not well educated on what the real numbers are in these stories. Like, what are the real numbers that we have? Is there a deeper story here with like EPA, DHA status that may be driving a bunch of this stuff? And not to say it doesn't matter, but the impact is much less if you're just ticking the boxes there. And then is it the same getting this from like whole food sources like nuts versus a pressed seed oil? And I got to say, it's a bummer because of my health stuff. Like, I don't really handle nuts the way that I used to. Like, they give me some GI problems. I have to be really sparing in my consumption of them. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answered it or I just drove it all off a cliff. But yeah.
I love it. I know we're on the exact same page. I'm to a fault. I think it maybe is hurting me being in no camp. I'm to a fault in no camp where maybe, it's not going to benefit me because I'm never going to be that super popular guy that like everyone rallies behind because he's so into one thing. I think you're right on that. There's so many nuances to it. And I don't know what else to say. I just agree. That it's not just one thing. And I will eat a salad. Well, actually, I don't eat much salads anymore. But if it has some whatever oil on it, it's like, all right, well, that's a tablespoon of oil in my month. That's fine.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
And I love that the DHA, I did see some of Matt Lalonde's presentations back in the day. That's some like ancestral health symposium, stuff like that. He had some good stuff on nutrient density, good stuff there. But I've been interviewing a lot of researchers like Michael Crawford, Dr. Lee Broadhurst, guys like Kanane do this type of research on the shore-based, this marine foods, high DHA diets that kind of drove our brain development. So I have another question, but I guess I'll quickly ask you about what you think about that stuff.
It's interesting. I've gone back and forth. I had some really cool conversations with Alan Savory about like the Homo aquaticus, that a big chunk of our evolution occurred at that ocean interface. I had pushed back on that. It's interesting. There's two vectors that at a minimum converge on high caloric density and a reasonably high intake of elongated omega-3 fats. One is the shore-based approach. The other is tool-using hominins that can break open the long bones and get access to significant amount of like monounsaturated fat, and then opening up the skulls of animals and getting the brain. And at the end of the day, both of those end up overlapping, and wouldn't be surprising if both of those were a factor. We probably had a chunk of, this shore-based element because, I mean, even for myself, I have a decent kind of like survival skill that I've built up. I did like that Caveman show, and I've continued to do things for building shelters and knowing what foods to eat and not eat and how to prepare them and everything. But that tide pool interface, you could be kind of an idiot and you could scratch together enough food to keep yourself going. Like the food there is really remarkably easy to obtain, and it replaces rather quickly. So yeah, that's kind of my thing, is that there's the tool use and animal carcasses as a vector, and then the shore-based thing. I think both of those likely play a role in all of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're mentioning some stuff that Dr. Michael Rose, I noticed you had him on the show. I had him on the show. You were talking about his like protein and longevity type of stuff. And that's really cool. But he was talking more about the bone marrow and the brains getting into there. But who cares? It's a mixture of both, probably. These other people, Michael Crawford interview came out today. He's an older guy out of London and doing a lot of this research, but he had a lot of good points too. But you can just gather mollusks. You're saying these mollusks are sitting around, they're replaceable, really nutrient dense. Why would we not do it? I'm just seeing more and more research about that. Or even like the women, hunter-gatherers. Women, they were gathering all this seafood, why not? Like,
one of the things that I push back on that is all populations still have reasonably high rates of shellfish allergy. So that's a really intriguing thing. Whereas like red meat, very, very difficult to develop an allergy to it. Like this new tick-borne illness can develop a specific IgG antibody response to it. But that's one thing that has pumped the brakes a little bit for me, is that iodine shellfish allergy is intriguing. And
I never thought about that.
Yeah, I've never... one thing I do often is like if somebody brings up a topic, say like celiac disease, what is the evolutionary advantage of celiac disease? And so I'll put in celiac disease, evolutionary advantage. And it's interesting. Folks with celiac disease tend to have a higher than normal immune response in the gut. And this seems to likely have been in response to agricultural living in proximity with other humans and whatnot. So in theory, you would be less prone to these diseases of bad water and bad food that would be more common within a hunter-gatherer population. I have not looked at what the potential evolutionary advantage is to a shellfish allergy, and I don't know if that is something that developed or it's just a random error that just pops up. But that is one thing that pushes me back on that shore-based evolutionary kind of picture. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, it could be something, that randomly popped up, or maybe it's different shellfish. I don't know, polluted waters. Right. Who knows? Or just some kind of weird thing that's not evolutionary. I think we don't have as much evolutionary pressure these days.
For sure.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So here's my bigger question. We were talking about, the seed oils, sugar, flour, all that type of stuff. I get really into this, making the film. What is the big reason? Like, what are your views on how this whole thing unfolded? Like, not what happened with Ansel Keys or anything like that, but what do you pin to be the biggest problems that made us have this giant uptick in obesity and chronic disease? You just call it since 1980.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, what is it? Like, some people try to pin it. Like, some guys like, it's the seed oils. That's it. And yes, there is a great increase. You can see that more than the carbs, like there's actually the sugar went down in the past decade because we kind of realized, don't eat so much sugar, but the seed oils are going up. I'm not saying that I'm pinning on seed oils at all. I'm just really curious because everyone has their own idea of like what went wrong, since 1980 when that sort of more sharp uptick occurred. Do you have a theory?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I tried to get this chapter in Wired to Eat and they passed on it. And so we ended up putting it in Sacred Cow. And I do think that like the Ansel Keys story is a piece. Like there became this kind of scientific push for this notion that animal products were bad. Richard Nixon also, when he was looking at obtaining re-election, he needed a conservative, dedicated voting base, and farmers were a good option. And so they expanded farm subsidies within that group. Mm-hmm. And right on the heels of that, we started getting massive stockpiles of food that was just literally going to waste. Like everything from like milk and cheese to corn products and whatnot. And we had known at that point how to make high fructose corn syrup for, 50 years, 80 years, but somebody developed a super inexpensive process for the development of high fructose corn syrup. So, and this is the thing that kind of makes me crazy when people zero in on one thing is that, well, there's a bunch of things. And if we focus on the one thing, then we're not going to be able to fix all of the things that are there. So like farm subsidies are a huge deal in this. Like we subsidize the production of shitty food, and then we have a dietary guideline process that for ages has given a pass of sugar and refined carbs because it was low fat and particularly low animal fat. And so I think it's all of those things going together. But then at the ultimate end of the day, what we started figuring out how to do is make really remarkably tasty food out of shit that really isn't food. Mm-hmm. That's kind of where the rubber hits the road. Like, okay, maybe seed oils aren't great for you, but when you fry corn chips in corn oil and put a glaze of like this modified cheese stuff on it with the right amount of paprika and salt and this and that, it's amazing. Like a Dorito is like, holy shit, like so good, like so tasty. And one of my talks, I had the Dorito roulette, where in a single bag of Doritos, they have mainly mild chips. They're spicy, but mild. They have a few medium chips, and then every once in a while, they have an exceptionally hot chip. And what they've done within one bag is provide a mixed palate experience. Like if you wanted to get an animal addicted to cocaine, you don't just put it in their water. You put it in the water, but at varying doses. Some days high, some days low, and you modify that, because then what it starts doing is creating an anticipatory expectation about, wow, is this next water or this next chip going to be the one? And so then you're entraining that dopamine response at a really sophisticated level. So while folks are kind of mucking around at this kind of molecular mechanism level, I think it's much more of like a food manufacturing story. Unilever years ago, they spent $64 million expanding their evolutionary biology research to inform their food production. And this is the main focus has been understanding the neurophysiology of appetite, the neuroregulation of appetite, the implications of like optimum foraging strategy and all these different things. So the food manufacturers are paying tons of money to understand our evolutionary biology to create food that is addictive. And when we make suggestions to the mainstream medical practitioners that our evolutionary biology may be an important factor in mitigating chronic degenerative disease, they look at us like we're fucking idiots. And so our gatekeepers are ignorant of the things that are driving these processes. A lot of our health educators, because we get rewarded for focusing and demonizing on one thing, then we focus on these one things and everybody gets in their little silos and they think that their pet idea is the one and only thing. So then we don't really critically analyze the research. And all the while, a lot of folks are making a ton of money off of people being unhealthy. So again, I don't know if I fully answered that question, but it's all of that stuff. But in my opinion, people are not really looking at the true mechanisms. Yes, seed oil is a problem. Yes, refined carbohydrates are a problem. But nobody drinks corn oil and then spoons up corn masa and eats it, whether like in a starvation setting. But when you mix all that stuff together and add all these other flavor profiles with it, then you've got a recipe for bypassing the neuroregulation of appetite, which is really kind of where the rubber hits the road on all this stuff. Like we're being encouraged to eat more food than what we need. Yeah.
Well, it's appropriate that you have your Wired to Eat book back there. No, I'm right there with you. The Dorito effect right there. I had Mark Schatzker on.
He's a great guy. He is so underappreciated in this community. Like that book was so good. So good.
So good. Yeah, no, I think he's up in Toronto. I was going to go to Toronto for this track meet until COVID. We were going to, have dinner and
Oh, nice.
Great guy. And it just all fell apart. One more thing, the lockdowns ruins. But I think you're right on. It's the brain is hardwired to seek calories, and now we don't need calories anymore. It's the simplest thing ever. And you laid it out well. There's all these things combined. And my pet theory, you don't want to get your pet thing, but my pet thing is trying to be at the highest level. This is kind of what you're talking about, which is satiety. So my pet theory is just about satiety, is that you're eating all these processed foods and they're not allowing you to be full for the right amount of time. That's the big problem. Is like, I don't know. It really all comes down to that. And then what's the solution to that is to eat whole foods. And if you eat whole foods, you are full properly. And that's why the carnivore diet works so well. You're full. That's why so many diets work well. Just because you're full. That's why vegans can do okay and lose weight, short term, right? Because they're eating whole foods. Maybe they have to eat 6 times a day and stuff themselves with leaves, but at least they're not, actually they report being always hungry. I've heard that a lot. They're always hungry. Right. They're eating whole foods. There's also, I hate the people that just, it's all about a calorie deficit. Yeah, I know. I get it. You have to find a way to create a calorie deficit.
How do you get there?
How? Exactly. And that's satiety. How you get there is be full.
Making an airplane fly. Well, it's all about having more lift than drag. It's like, okay, getting a PhD in aerodynamics is a fucking bastard. There's a lot going on there to make an airplane work, to understand, calories absolutely matter. And some of these things like low carb, ketogenic, carnivore type diets, they tend to disproportionately work because of the remarkable satiety effects that they provide. Like kind of a monochromatic dietary experience is much better for us in this modern food environment. In an ancestral environment, we were driven to seek as wide a variety of foods as we could, both to minimize toxicant ingestion and also to enhance the profile of our nutrients. And today, like Stefan Guyenet has made the case that it's kind of, I forget exactly how he couched it, but like a baked potato plain is hard to overeat. A baked potato with some salt is easier. Some baked potato with some salt and olive oil, still easier. If you do something crazy and take that potato, don't bake it, cut it very thin, fry it in butter, and then cover it in salt, there's no off switch. Like I would digest that faster than what I could eat it. I could never stop eating potato chips.
It's so true. And I think that the protein comes back around in that.
Yes.
And I have a friend, Christy, who works with me. She was just looking at the video. I interviewed you 2 years ago at Metabolic Health Summit. And it was supposed to be this little quick interview about Metabolic Health Summit. I ended up just pretending it was a real interview, and like just going crazy and asking all these questions. And she told me, she was just reviewing the film and said we were talking about the protein leverage hypothesis and all these interesting ideas. So that kind of just came back around. Is this potato chip, it has no protein. Like a lot of these foods that are hyperpalatable have very low protein. And our other mutual friend, Dr. Ted Naiman, I think it's a really simple kind of equation.
His PE deal is genius. Yeah.
I love the PE stuff, but even his broader stuff of just going back to explaining how we went to hell since 1980 is when you go from 15% protein to 12% protein, that 3% energy drop or protein drop can explain why someone would eat 300 more calories per day. There's a book, Eat Like the Animals. What is it? Robbenheimer and Simpson, the two researchers. Another guy, Marty Kendall, great nutrition friend that we both know, wrote an article about it. This is all coming back around in circles about that they kind of falsified their data. I don't know if you caught this long blog post he did, but he dug into their data and he found out. Have you read Eat Like the Animals?
I have not. No.
Great book. But the problem is it gets a lot of things wrong. It thinks protein's bad. They have this cognitive dissonance where they're like, protein is fantastic for growing people, mothers, kids, fantastic for old people, but somehow bad for you in your midlife.
Everybody else. Yeah.
And so it's because they did the mice data, they did the rodent studies, and they did the protein. They threw out all the mice that died early on the very low protein diets. Right? And just screaming like, this is the problem. That. Yeah. They died because they were on the very low protein diet. You need to include them. So he put the data back in, and they found that there was no problem with protein.
Right.
That it threw off the data. So I suggest people eat like the animals. It's really great. These guys, it's
just as
it's all about
quick aside, the T. Cole and Campbell China study stuff, when you dig into that, animals that eat higher protein end up developing, in theory, more cancer. But what isn't explained in there is that they develop the cancer later, and it's only because they're being fed huge amounts of aflatoxin, which is going to give anybody or anything cancer. The increased protein intake was protective against the cancer. Then once you had cancer, having that high protein intake wasn't as beneficial for them because you're providing a growth substrate. Yeah.
It's interesting. But the protein leverage hypothesis, so that's different from Ted's P to E diet. We're kind of ending our time here, but I think that it's just a lot. It has to do with satiety. It has to do with kind of what went wrong with our whole dietary guidelines, is that if you drop your protein, you're going to eat more to achieve the same level of protein. Yeah. So just, any thoughts on how that fits in?
I think that that's spot on. And I think that it explains why we have folks in the really extreme low protein, say like keto camps, that they start seeing their weight creep up. And if your protein is inadequate, you will generally overeat whatever else is around, whether that's carbs or
like
fat.
Potato chips.
Yeah, like potato chips or sticks of butter. And it's amazing to me that folks are able to so break something that is so highly satiating. A general ketogenic diet is pretty darn satiating. But if you drop protein levels low enough, you will be hungry all the damn time. And then you will do things like the fat bombs and whatnot. And like it is no problem for me to mix up some sort of like a buttered coffee and have 1,000 calories there. And it's kind of one thing if I'm hiking the Pacific Crest Trail and I'm carrying a 60-pound pack and, I'm really moving my ass. It's like, okay, that makes sense. But I do some jujitsu, I lift some weights. And other than that, I mainly do what you're looking at here, which is sit on my ass. So I don't really need that many calories. I would like to eat enough protein to maintain the muscle and bone density that I've got and all that type of stuff. But yeah, I really do. I think mechanistically, if you were to focus on a thing, like the inadequate protein intake really drives this stuff. I guess the one caveat I'd put in that is that adequate protein intake amidst a hyper palatable, highly processed food environment isn't really going to help it. Like you're just, in my opinion, still going to overeat in general. Like you're still going to have to kind of limit palate options to some degree. Otherwise, you're going to have a tendency to overeat.
Well, exactly. I mean, you could eat a big steak and then someone hands you a bag of chips and I could still crush the whole bag of chips.
Yeah.
So, all right. So I want to get into some electrolyte stuff at the end here because you sent me some of your great stuff. You call it Element, right?
Element.
Not LMT. Element. So I've had it for years. I get it at the conferences and all that stuff. And thanks for sending that.
Absolutely.
I just had some listener questions too around it, right? And they're wondering, why do we need electrolyte supplementation these days when there's one, it's like our soil is deficient in magnesium, that kind of thing. I don't know if that's all it is, but this listener said when in the past we were more active maybe, and we didn't need electrolytes. So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple of different angles on this. One of them is when we look at the sodium content specifically, and that I'm really going to kind of drill down on sodium. And the reason why when we put this thing together, we looked at, I co-founded it with Tyler and Luis from Keto Games. Oh, yeah. And we looked at 200-300 different diet recollections that people have been putting into Chronometer. And, it's protein, carbs, fat, and it also breaks down like the sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium. And what we found is that people were doing, because most of the folks there eat largely whole unprocessed foods, they were generally pretty good on calcium. They were a little low on magnesium, a little low on potassium, but they were really, really deficient on sodium, particularly for that kind of low carb scenario. If you are put on a medically supervised ketogenic diet, part of the reason why we don't see the hair loss and the thyroid problems and all that stuff with kids on a medically supervised ketogenic diet is they make sure that they get adequate sodium. So that could also make the case that maybe we're not supposed to be in ketosis every day all the time, which is a whole other thing. I feel the best there, so it's kind of a tough thing for me. Like I'm not entirely sure how to square that, but that's a piece of it. Another piece is when you look at mammal tissue in general, it tends to have about 1 gram of sodium per kilogram of meat. And that's the way that we kill and process animals currently. Most of the sodium in organisms' body is actually in the extracellular matrix. It's in the the blood plasma and whatnot. And it's that sodium potassium gradient that drives all the ATP production and all the cellular processes. We have a higher concentration outside of cells of sodium, higher concentration of potassium inside cells. When that sodium gradient occurs, then it drives the ATP pump and whatnot. When an organism dies, those two things equilibrate. The potassium leaves the cells, the sodium enters the cells. And I haven't been able to track down a ton of data on this, but just the stuff that I found is traditional butchering methods that don't bleed animals at least double the sodium content in meat. So that's a place that we were getting some sodium from more traditional sources. Even most primates that have been studied find salt reserves within their environment. So like butterflies will find salt deposits and stuff. Like sodium is kind of other than at that ocean interface, it's kind of a rare, vital, nutrient that organisms oftentimes have to work to be able to obtain. But that's one place that I think that we could get more from an ancestral perspective. This other thing is kind of controversial. That part, I think there's decent science to support. This other part is going to be both controversial and is definitely an opinion piece. But I think we drink too many fluids now. I think part of the reason why we need to supplement electrolytes to the degree that we do, like we have a big ass coffee, we have this, we have that. And where we see this go sideways is actually on the flip side of this, when people overhydrate for like physical activity. And when I say hydrate, there's an important caveat to make there. In a textbook of medical physiology, hydration means the water and the electrolyte constituents together. Somewhere along the line, we associated hydration only with water. And we know that if people are, say, like hyponatremic, if they have too low of sodium already and they drink more water, the body will then start excreting both potassium and sodium by extension, trying to re-equilibrate things. And people can die from that. So when you read some of the ancestral accounts, like, people weren't drinking huge amounts of water. And there's some of this stuff of, going into ketosis, even if it's intermittent, like you might make 200, 300 milliliters a day of metabolic water from like fat, mobilization and whatnot. So the condensation reaction of beta oxidation of fat, 200 or 300 milliliters isn't huge, but it's a non-trivial amount that could be some of the background level of where we would have obtained water in our environment. So there's a couple of different things out there from like the ancestral health side that I think kind of explain some of it. And then on a more modern footing, we just see people feel better and perform better. Also, their satiety seems to be better when they get adequate sodium levels. Adequate sodium really suppresses cortisol production, antidiuretic hormone, a bunch of these adrenal hormones that whenever one is released, usually some degree of all of them are released. Epinephrine, and all these things are kind of stress-inducing hormones. So adequate sodium levels in particular tend to reduce stress. When we reduce stress, we tend to eat less. So we see performance improve with adequate electrolytes, specifically sodium. We see better dietary compliance because I think that the stress levels are kind of mitigated. And then because we did at least launch within this paleo ancestral health space, keto, people are not eating the huge amounts of carbohydrates that cause them to retain sodium. So I think there's definitely a benefit there.
That's great. Now, I think this modern society is part of what we got wrong is you got to drink like 10 jugs of water a day. Maybe if you're eating a terrible diet and you're a mess, you might need to. But otherwise, I drink as much water as I need. And I think that's right. I think, we are watering down our electrolytes by drinking too much water. And then also, I think we followed animals to salt licks, or we could find these big ruminant animals would find them, and all early humans could get salt in that way. Right. And also, we're going to Africa soon to film one last segment for Food Lies, and we're going to check out the Hadza and the Maasaians,
Oh, nice.
2 or 3 other tribes. So I'm going to, ask them. I want to see what they do, see how much water they're drinking.
Yep.
Look at drinking the blood. At least the Maasai are, they're getting some of the salt. Last little add-on to that is another listener asked about why 200 milligrams of potassium. They thought it was a little low. Is there like a reason for the ratio?
Yeah, like everybody's super geeked out on the potassium, but we're kind of assuming that folks are eating a largely whole, unprocessed food diet. And if you do that, you tend to do pretty well on the potassium. And again, what folks don't really appreciate, if you don't have enough sodium, the potassium, I wouldn't say it doesn't matter, but extra potassium isn't actually helping you. It can worsen things. You end up in that hyperkalemia state, which you can end up with cardiac arrhythmias and all kinds of problems there. So we didn't haphazardly formulate it. Like we really looked at it's interesting because when we really started looking at this, like getting the sodium right gave you a lot more latitude on everything else. And again, assuming that folks are eating a largely whole, unprocessed food diet, whether that's carnivore or keto or paleo, they're typically getting really remarkably high amounts of potassium out of that.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. And the absolute last question from my good pal, Dr. Sean O'Mara. I don't know if you've come across this guy.
Yep.
Great guy. Yeah.
Great
Visceral
guy.
Fat.
Yep.
He's asking, this is the big ending. What is your long-term life goals? What's your idea of long-term success? What are you trying to do other than talk to people on podcasts and help them get healthier? Maybe that is your long-term life goal.
Yeah. I've always enjoyed kind of health education and whatnot. I have kind of interesting split roles now. I'm a husband, I'm a dad. So like that being a good dad is a really, really big thing for me at this point. My girls are 8 and 6, which is still young, but I think about it, and Zoe is 8 years old. That's almost 10 years. And in 10 years, she's going to be out of the house. And it went by like that, just so fast. And so I'm really trying to be present and a good dad and a good example there. And also, I guess more beyond that, I really want a good world for the girls to inherit, hopefully a better world than what I lived in. And I think there's some really remarkable challenges there. We touched on some of it, censorship, our kind of broken food systems. I've been ringing this alarm bell that meat and meat inclusive diets would get attached to negative elements of climate change, and it would start getting assailed from the highest levels of government, international government. And this is happening. And it's coming almost exclusively from one side of the political spectrum. I don't know how to square that, but it's a really, really big problem. And there are people out there that are huge advocates, say, for like the autoimmune paleo diet, which is great. It helps people. But you will not be able to help people with that if meat is made illegal or remarkably expensive, or we do crazy things with our energy sector so that our economy crashes and whatnot. And so fortunately or unfortunately, I find myself going ever more into these kind of sociopolitical directions, because just talking about protein, carbs, fat is not going to change a goddamn thing. We always want to expand the scientific frontier, but I'm never going to contribute anything of merit in that space again. Like, I don't know if my interest isn't there, or like it's just gotten so granular that like, unless I was a lead researcher in one particular area, like, I don't know that we need to know too much more to really be effective there. But people don't understand like the way our economic systems work, and they are assailing against things that are counter to freedom, that are counter to actually lifting people out of poverty and whatnot. And so I find myself spending more time doing work and commenting on those directions. And the unfortunate thing with that is it is incredibly divisive. I think people think I'm doing it to like be mean or something, but it's interesting when people disagree with kind of like the sociopolitical observations I have, then they will say, well, you're just a nutritionist, you need to stay in your lane. They don't actually address the topic at hand. They just do this kind of like straw man dismissal. And so that's more and more where I find myself going. And that's part of the reason why we decided to go ahead and do Sacred Cow, both the film and the book, because it brings a bunch of that stuff together. It addresses some social justice issues that need addressing, but also looks at the thermodynamics of energy capture with a ruminant-based food system, and grasslands and mitigating climate change and all that. And it's a huge topic to try to unpack, and it's really politically uncool right now. Like, if you want to be cool and hot and sexy, you're vegan and you're anti-meat and your meal ticket is written. Like, the stuff that I'm talking about are antithetical to just about everything that everybody wants to consider. Not fully in like the industrialized meat camp. So like real conservative people don't like some of the things that I talk about. I'm too market and capitalism based for the really kind of like fans of socialism to really rally behind me. So I find that I just piss almost everybody off. And the gratification of the work that I do has plummeted, but it's also this thing where I just don't see anybody else tackling any of this shit. And maybe I'm right. Hopefully I am. And hopefully it's providing value, or maybe I'm wrong. And hopefully with the free exchange of ideas, people convince me that I'm wrong and I can shift gears on that. But more of my effort is going to be put into like food systems and healthcare and understanding like energy in our global economic story and understanding the implications for like poverty and freedom. And it's a lot. It's just an enormous amount to unpack, and it's not super popular. And I'm never going to drive things in such a way that I make a living being like a political commentator, because nobody wants a political commentator who's a radical centrist. Like, I would have to pick one side of the political divide or the other. And to do that, I would need to lobotomize myself to a bunch of reality. So I don't know, man. I'm just kind of slowly committing career suicide by trying to make the world a little better place. So.
Oh man, this is music to my ears. I love it. I love all that radical centrists. Yeah, I mean, just freedom. This is how we do it. And yes, people tell me to stay in my lane too, but our lane is more than just talking about macros. Like you said, our lane isn't just like, all right, we're going to here's your biochemistry and why you should do this. No, we need to talk about the food systems. We need to talk about how to get people out of poverty. There's the poorest billion of people in the world. I use this stat in a presentation. The poorest billion people in the world rely on animals the most. Right. These are for their living. And we can level the playing field with these lower socioeconomic statuses by giving them better information and having them understand that meat is healthy, and then they wouldn't have so much healthcare burden and so much disease.
I would even caution a little bit in couching it that way. Largely what needs to be done is like, hey, what you guys are doing is working. Don't do what we're doing. Don't buy what Nestle and Monsanto and everybody else is exporting. Your traditional food ways and food systems are legit. And then how do we help those people get out of abject poverty while not ruining the food systems that have done great for them for thousands of years? Yeah, I would even add a little cautionary feature to that. Like, there are a lot of people doing shit a lot better than what we're doing. And the tendency is to go foist upon them this idea that, oh, you need to be dependent on the grain exports of the United States and Europe. And it's like, no, you don't. Like, that would be a terrible idea.
Well, that's what I fear from the powers that be that are wanting to globalize things. They're the ones pushing the plant-based agenda at the highest level. These are the Bill Gates. These are the people invested in all these things that they think they know better than the world. They think by controlling the food system, they're going to create a more, they call it, the equitable and, fair world. And I think it is a nightmare waiting to happen. They're going to push all these things you just said. Let's get Nestle and let's get all these fake foods out there, give them sacks of grain, and that's going to save the world. It is the exact opposite.
I agree. And it for my friends that are more on, say, like the progressive side of the political spectrum, I know most of those people don't like big corporations. The direction that all of this is going, that is all we will have. You will not have an artisanal coffee shop to go get your soy spice latte. You will have Starbucks and nothing else, because COVID has just put that whole process on steroids. The only things that are going to exist are these massive corporations that they get government bailouts to be able to navigate these economic challenges. They have huge war chests to be able to wait these situations out. Texas has been a different story. They've kept more things open, but like when we went back to visit our family in Reno, the mom and pop owned hardware stores were closed because they were deemed non-essential. But Home Depot and Lowe's were open because they were deemed essential. And that's just happening everywhere. And again, it's like a million different things. But this again, it circles back around to, are we better off with more freedom or less freedom? And it's not to say that that's not messy, that there aren't things that we need to think about with that. But this globalization, in my opinion, is like the number one issue that we need to rail against. And if you're concerned about social justice issues and racial inequality, I can make a pretty airtight case that globalization it's like so many people in the ancestral health space pride themselves on thinking about things from root cause. I would just offer the suggestion that they're not thinking about root cause when they think about these social justice issues, and that globalization is root cause. Maybe I'm wrong, but get in and explore it. And at least then you can say, hey, Rob, you're wrong. And here are the following 10 reasons why you're wrong. And then I won't be dumb. And then I can move on. But if a person just says, well, you're white and male and privileged and a nutritionist and stay in your lane, they didn't learn anything. And I'm sure as hell not going to improve what my messaging is from that type of feedback.
I'd love to be proven wrong on this. I've gone down some rabbit holes. Like I said, I woke up because of COVID. I've been looking into this stuff from tracing back through the course of the United States history and wealth accumulation and the powers that be and globalists. There's a lot of interesting stuff out there. I hate to get into this at the last second with this conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy stuff. The power structures still exist. They've always existed from the times when we went from hunter-gatherers till Egypt. In Egypt, and grain was actually part of that. The accumulation of wealth happened by storing grains, and there were the pharaohs and there were the peasants. And I believe there are still the pharaohs and the peasants. And you could be making $1 million a year and you're still a peasant compared to the globalist people that are pushing some of these things. And we're wondering, why is this happening? Why is this happening? I think you trace it back to some big powers that want to push their agenda. And I'll leave it at that.
I completely agree. And for folks to noodle on, what is a way to democratize that whole and undo that system? It's uniform access to information. That is a thing that could change all of this. And that is why they want to control the ability to censor things like that. That is really part and parcel. Like this is why it's just so heartbreaking when I've encountered so many people that are just like, well, some of this stuff needs to be controlled and this and that. And I mean, if somebody's calling for violence against someone, yeah, absolutely. They need to be shut down. They probably need more than that to happen. But bad ideas need to be available right alongside good ideas, because the alternative is that we are only told the ideas that are deemed appropriate for us to know. And then there is no way to undo this. Like it could be the 1,000 years of tyranny under a system like that.
I told people, read 1984. This is the time to read the book, 1984. This is what you're talking about. When they control the information, it's a thought police. That's where that term got coined. Big brother, like this, when they have control, then that's when, yes, tyranny starts. And yes, these are the people, the gatekeepers of information. You don't want gatekeepers of information. I don't know how you can debunk that, right? You can call me a conspiracy theorist, but try to debunk the fact that you don't want gatekeepers.
Wouldn't you want to be the gatekeeper of your information? And this is the crazy thing is they're like, well, yeah, for me, but for all the dummies out there, I want somebody else to control it for them. And they don't understand the danger and the hypocrisy with that. Yeah.
Okay. I could go on forever. This has been quite a treat. One of my favorite podcasts ever. Thank you so much for all that you do. You got your Healthy Rebellion shirt. Where can people find you?
I spend most of my time over at the Healthy Rebellion. I do a lot of stuff over at drinkelement.com. I dabble on the social media at this point. I kind of just do like a drive-by shooting. I'll post something, dump it. I don't really do a lot of curating of comments on there because it's just a buzzkill, like having people just assail you constantly. There are a lot of really good, generous, thoughtful people that I really appreciate. So I do try to pop my hand in occasionally. I guess Instagram at DOS Rob Wolf is kind of the main one I'm active on, but yeah, those are kind of the places to track me down at this point. And then the Healthy Rebellion Radio is where my wife and I do our Q&A podcast.
I love that. Yeah, I love seeing those on Instagram. Great little sound bites there of information. Everyone support Robb. He's doing great things, and we'll link to everything in the show notes. And thank you so much, man.
Thank you. Huge honor.
Okay, there we go. Another one in the books. Thanks for sharing this with friends and family. Start back at episode 1. Give it a review on iTunes or any other podcast app. Subscribe to it on Spotify. Subscribe to the Sapien podcast as well. Check out nosetail.org for all the products and sapien.org for all the health information and other services we offer with Dr. Gary. So, see you next week.